Part 1. The First Funeral. A Message from the Dead. The call came just after midnight. Emily stared at the glowing screen of her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. It was her aunt, voice low and tight with shock. "Your grandmother passed away, Em? You should come home." The words echoed in her ears long after the call ended. Emily hadn't been back to her hometown in nearly 6 years. It wasn't that she disliked the place. There had been warmth there once, laughter, and the quiet scent of jasmine from her grandmother's garden. But ever since her mother's passing, the place had felt like a memory she didn't want to relive. Now the past was pulling her back. Return to Grayfield. The train to Grayfield Village rumbled through the early morning mist. As Emily looked out the window, her reflection stared back, pale and uncertain. She clutched her coat tighter around her, trying to suppress the unease that had settled in her chest since the call. When she arrived at the small station, the air felt heavy, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Her Uncle Ben met her with a curt nod and a tired smile. "You came fast," he said. "I needed to," she replied. "Good. We're burying her this evening." "Tonight?" Emily blinked. That was fast. Too fast. Traditionally, funerals here were held after 3 days. She left instructions, Uncle Ben muttered, avoiding her eyes. The house felt the same and yet completely different. The flowers in the yard were gone, replaced by dry, tangled weeds. The windows, once bright with life, were shuttered and dark. Inside, her grandmother's body lay in an open casket in the living room. Emily approached slowly. Her grandmother, Margaret Lang, looked peaceful, but stiff. Something about the way her hands were folded too perfectly made her skin crawl. As Emily leaned in, a faint scent, something like dried herbs and old soil, tickled her nose. "She died in her sleep," Aunt Nora whispered behind her. "No pain." But Emily wasn't convinced. A stranger in white. The funeral procession moved through the village that evening. The sun had barely dipped below the trees, yet the shadows stretched long and unnatural. Villagers whispered softly as they followed the casket. It was a modest affair, somber and quiet, with no wailing or loud prayers. As they approached the cemetery at the edge of the village, Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. She turned, eyes scanning the crowd. And that's when she saw him. At the far end of the line of mourners stood a tall man dressed in white. His face was pale and smooth like wax, and his head was bowed. His hands hung loosely at his sides, unmoving. He didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even breathe. He simply stood there. Emily's gaze lingered on him too long, and when she blinked, he was gone. She looked around, confused. "Did you see?" she began to ask her cousin Michael. "See what?" "Nothing," she muttered, uneasy. The burial was quick. The coffin was lowered, the dirt shoveled, and people dispersed almost in a trance. The priest barely spoke. No eulogies, no memories, only silence. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The dream that night, Emily stayed in her grandmother's old room. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking. The mirror was covered with a black cloth. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, exhaustion finally took her. And then she dreamed. She was standing in the cemetery again. The wind blew cold and sharp. The fresh grave was open, and from within it came a voice. "Emily." Her grandmother stood beside the grave, her eyes milky white, skin pale and stretched thin. Her mouth didn't move, but the voice echoed around Emily like a whisper inside her skull. "Don't go to the next one." Emily tried to speak, but her throat closed up. Her grandmother's hand reached out and gripped hers, ice cold and trembling. "There will be 3 more funerals. Don't let them take you." Suddenly, behind the grave, the man in white appeared again. He stepped forward, his feet not touching the ground, his head still bowed. Her grandmother screamed. Emily woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "The second is coming." A village of secrets. In the morning, Emily went to the kitchen, where Aunt Nora was making tea. She hesitated, then asked, "Did Grandma ever mention anything about being afraid of death?" Aunt Nora paused. "Why would you ask that?" She rushed her own funeral, didn't want prayers, didn't want to be seen. Her aunt's face turned grim. "Margaret saw things toward the end, said death had a face, said it came in white." Emily's blood turned cold. "Did anyone else ever see him?" Aunt Nora didn't answer. Later, Emily wandered the village, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. She stopped by the old bookstore, now half abandoned. Inside, the elderly owner, Mr. Elias, squinted at her. You're Margaret's girl, aren't you? Emily nodded. Your grandmother was wise. She knew the signs. The first funeral always brings the others. What signs? He leaned closer. A man in white. He only shows himself to those who are next. Unseen threads. Back at the house, Emily went through her grandmother's things. In the drawer of an old wooden chest, she found a black-bound journal filled with notes. One entry stood out. The funerals come in a sequence. One follows the next. The white mourner comes for the marked. I saw him at Helen's funeral, then Edward's, then Samuel's, always three, always me last. But I broke the chain. I buried myself before he could. Emily's hands trembled as she read. If you see him, you are already part of it. She slammed the book shut, heart pounding. The whisper returned, the dream returned. Only this time, the graveyard was full. Rows and rows of open graves. In each stood a figure wearing white, face hidden, head bowed. Her grandmother knelt at the edge of the largest one, crying. I tried to stop him, she said. He needs three, and then he vanishes for a time. Emily turned, and standing behind her, him again. Closer now. She tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Her feet sank into the ground like wet mud. The air was thick and buzzing with invisible voices. The second is almost here, a voice whispered into her ear. She woke, again, choking back a cry. The second call. The morning light did nothing to lift the weight in Emily's chest. Her phone buzzed. It was Mira, an old classmate from Grayfield. Emily, did you hear? Jason's dead. Car crash. They're holding the funeral tomorrow. Emily froze. Jason, a friend from childhood. A kind boy with a gentle laugh funeral. Her hands trembled. No, she whispered to herself. This can't be real. She opened the black-bound journal again. In the back was a list of names, each paired with a date. The spacing between each name was consistent. 3 days, just like now, the march toward death. She went to Jason's funeral. She had to. The ceremony was held in the village church. It was brighter than her grandmother's, more organized, but that did nothing to soothe her nerves. She sat in the back row, watching, and then she saw him. The man in white. He was closer now, only a few feet away. No one else reacted. No one looked at him. It was as if he existed in a layer of reality only she could see. Emily snapped a photo with her phone. Click. She looked down at the screen. He wasn't in the image. The spot where he stood was empty. The warning that night her grandmother returned once more in her dream. The final one is you, Emily. Why me, she sobbed. Because you looked. Because you came back. Can I stop it? Her grandmother reached out. Yes, but only if you find his name. The white mourner was once a man. His grief chained him. His pain feeds the curse. Find his name or be buried in silence. The silence settles. Emily awoke before dawn. In her hand was something she hadn't gone to bed with. A folded piece of old, brittle paper. On it, written in faded ink, were 3 words, Remember the Hollow. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew where she had to go next. The funerals were not random. They were a pattern, and she was next. Part 2, the second funeral, the man in white. The cemetery was quiet again. Only this time, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. Emily stood beside Jason's grave, the earth still soft from the burial the day before. A cold wind swept through the trees as if exhaling the breath of something ancient and unseen. She held her phone in her gloved hands, staring at the photo she had taken during the funeral. Nothing. The aisle where the man in white had stood was empty in the picture. Just a patch of dim carpet and shadow, and yet she remembered him clearly. His figure, tall, expressionless, still, the way he hovered near the coffin without moving, only she could see him, and that terrified her more than anything. Remember the hollow. The message she had found after her dream still echoed in her mind. Remember the hollow. It wasn't a place she knew by name. Not anymore. But after hours of digging through village records and dusty family photo albums in her grandmother's attic, she found a clue. An old photo of her grandmother and 2 other children standing in front of a steep wooded ravine. Written on the back, Summer 1959, the hollow. The hollow, she realized, was a patch of forest on the northern edge of Grayfield village, just past the old mill. No one had mentioned it in years. She vaguely remembered her grandmother warning her as a child, never wander past the mill. That land doesn't forget. Into the hollow. The sun hadn't yet risen when Emily made her way there. Morning fog wrapped around her ankles like cold fingers. The path was barely visible, choked by roots and undergrowth. She walked slowly, the forest growing darker as she descended. Birds didn't sing here. Even the wind was reluctant. Finally, she came upon it, a clearing surrounded by leaning gravestones, old and crumbling, some half swallowed by the earth. In the center stood a stone marker, taller than the rest, covered in moss. She brushed the moss away. One word carved deep, Alden. Her breath caught. This must be the name. The one her grandmother mentioned in her dream. The man in white had once been Alden, the forgotten mourner. Back at the house, Emily opened her grandmother's black journal again, flipping to the final pages. There, tucked between two stuck pages, she found a folded note she had missed before. Alden White, 1883 and 1907, died grieving, refused the next life. His mourning became eternal. Each funeral brings him strength. 3 deaths before he disappears. Then the cycle begins again. I buried myself to stop it. Emily's hands shook. 3 deaths, then silence. But now he had started again. Her grandmother was the first, Jason the second, and she was the third. Unless she could break the cycle. Digging deeper, Emily went to the village library, what remained of it. A single room of dusty shelves, most of them untouched. With effort, she found an archive of deaths and burials in Grayfield village dating back over a century. A pattern emerged. Every few years, always spaced far enough apart to be forgotten, there would be a sudden cluster of 3 funerals within a week. Always 3. Never more. And each time, someone would vanish after the 3rd. Not die, not buried, just gone. The townsfolk called it the sorrow season, but no one ever said why. One entry stood out. 1907, Alden White, 24, cause of death unknown, body never found. Grave marker placed in hollow by request of mother. That was the marker Emily had found. No body, just a name. He comes closer. That night, Emily dreamt again, but it was no longer a dream. She stood in her grandmother's room. Everything was quiet. Then the door creaked open, slowly, and he entered. The man in white, closer now. His head still bowed, but his hands were reaching out, trembling with an emotion Emily couldn't name. Grief, rage, hunger. She tried to move, to speak, to scream, but her voice was gone. His fingers brushed her shoulder, and suddenly the room shifted. She stood in a funeral parlor with herself in the coffin, eyes closed, hands folded, a mirror image of what her grandmother looked like just days ago. He stood over her corpse. "You are the 3rd," he whispered. "Another death?" Emily woke up sobbing, but this time she wasn't alone. Her phone buzzed violently on the nightstand. A text from Mira. "Emily, I think something happened to Michael." Michael, her cousin, the one who stood beside her at her grandmother's funeral. Emily called immediately. "What happened?" "He was found, collapsed, at home. No sign of trauma. The doctors don't know. He's in a coma. Not dead, but not alive either." The curse wasn't waiting. It was speeding up. She ran to the hospital, but Michael was unresponsive. His heart beat, his lungs worked, but there was no light in his eyes. Emily stood by his bedside and whispered, "I won't let you be the 3rd." Mourner with no shadow, Emily needed proof. Something tangible. She returned to Jason's funeral hall and reviewed the security footage. It took some bribing, but she got the tapes from the hallway. Fast forwarding through the grainy footage, she saw herself entering the building. And then, behind her, him, a man in white, just a blur. But here's what made her blood freeze. He left no shadow. Every person who passed beneath the lights cast long, flickering shapes behind them. But not him. He walked in pure stillness, untouched by light. Breaking the chain. Emily couldn't sleep. She returned to the hollow again in the dead of night. This time she carried salt, candles, and a lock of her grandmother's hair, left inside the journal as if waiting to be used. She stood before Alden's stone and whispered into the cold. "Alden White, I know your name. I know your pain." The wind shifted. Behind her, leaves rustled. "You mourned someone, didn't you? Someone taken before their time." A chill wrapped around her body like a shroud. But this isn't how grief works. You can't chain others to your sorrow. The earth trembled slightly beneath her feet. Then a shape emerged from the shadows. A woman, young, pale. She looked at Emily with wide, tear-filled eyes. Emily whispered, "Is this her, the one he mourns?" The ghost woman nodded, and then faded. A moment later, Alden stood before her, Face exposed, he looked nothing like a monster, just a man, broken beyond repair. She never came back, he said, voice hollow, so I bring others to me. She's waiting for you, Emily said, but not here, not like this. Tears welled in his eyes, and for a moment the forest went completely still. The third funeral back at the hospital, Michael stirred. His fingers twitched. He whispered hoarsely, Emily? She wept, overwhelmed with relief. But her victory was short-lived. That night the phone rang. Her heart sank when she heard Mira's voice. It's my mother. She passed away this morning. We're holding the funeral on Friday. Emily dropped the phone. The cycle wasn't broken. Alden had simply chosen a different third. What comes next? In her final dream that night, her grandmother appeared again. They stood together at the edge of the hollow. You tried, Emily, she said softly. He's too far gone, Emily whispered. No, you made him feel. That's more than anyone's done. But it's still going to happen. Yes, her grandmother admitted, until the hollow is sealed, until someone chooses to stay. Emily turned to her. Stay? Her grandmother nodded. He needs a mourner who won't forget him. Emily woke up with a single name carved into the window glass beside her bed. Alden remembers. Part 3. The Final Funeral. The Empty Coffin. The morning of the third funeral arrived with an unnatural stillness. Emily stood at her window, watching the thick fog roll through Grayfield like a living thing. Trees blurred into silhouettes. The world felt suspended, as if waiting. Below, a line of mourners began to form outside the church, all in black. But no one was crying, and the man in white was already there. He stood near the gate, unmoving, his head still bowed. As always, no one seemed to notice him, except Emily. Today was the funeral of Mira's mother, Mrs. Hastings. The woman had passed peacefully in her sleep, just 2 days after Jason's funeral. No illness, no prior signs, just gone. The third death, the final piece. Emily had failed to stop it, the coffin without weight. Emily arrived late, deliberately. She didn't want to be in the procession. She didn't want to walk beside death again. The church pews were lined with familiar faces. Mira, eyes red but dry. The local priest, lips pursed into a permanent frown, and a few silent townsfolk. The coffin stood at the front, pale wood and polished brass. But something felt wrong. As the priest spoke his sermon, Emily moved closer, her eyes fixed on the casket. It wasn't grief that unsettled her. It was emptiness. She couldn't explain it, but the coffin looked too light. There was no solemnity in its presence, no burden. It didn't feel like death. It felt like bait. The fourth mourner. After the service, as people filtered into the cemetery, Emily pulled Mira aside. Did you see who carried the coffin? She asked. Mira frowned. Yes, why? Was it heavy? Mira hesitated. Actually, no. Now that you mention it, it felt like nothing. We joked about it. Emily's throat tightened. It was happening. The third death wasn't real. The coffin was empty, which meant the funeral is for someone else, she whispered. Mira blinked. What? Emily turned to the crowd. The man in white stood by the open grave, his figure almost blending into the fog. He was smiling. Into the hollow again Emily ran. Past the church, past the crowd, into the woods, into the hollow. She knew what she had to do now. The final page of her grandmother's journal had been clear, if cryptic. An empty coffin invites a living soul. The chain can only be broken if someone steps in willingly, or if his name is buried with truth. Alden's story had never been told fully. Only fragments. Emily needed more. She had seen his sorrow, but not its source, not the wound that made him trap others in his eternal grief. At the center of the hollow, beside Alden's gravestone, she knelt and began to dig. The box beneath her hands bled as she unearthed the roots and dirt. Just beneath the surface, she struck something solid. A small iron box, rusted shut. It took all her strength to pry it open. Inside, yellowed letters, a ribbon stained with blood, and a cracked photograph of a young woman. The back read, "To Alden, my beloved, I'll wait for you." Emily's breath caught. Clara. She had seen her before, the ghostly figure in the forest. Alden's grief wasn't born of anger. It was born of a promise broken by death. As Emily held the photo, the fog thickened. The air around her turned heavy, and then he appeared. Face to face. Alden stood before her, closer than ever. This time his head lifted. His face was beautiful and broken. Hollow eyes, mouth trembling, a man forever suspended in mourning. "You found her," he whispered. Emily nodded. "She loved you. She waited." He stepped closer. She died before I could return. I buried myself in sorrow. But the funerals, they made people remember. And remembering gave me form. But you took innocent lives. He looked down. I didn't want to be forgotten. If I had 3 to mourn me, I would feel alive again. Emily held out the box. You don't need more funerals. You need peace. Alden reached out, his fingers grazing the photograph. He began to weep. The choice. The ground trembled. The air rippled. A voice echoed in Emily's ears, her grandmother's. This is the moment, Emily. He can move on. If someone ends the chain, if someone takes his place. Emily understood now. The funeral with the empty coffin wasn't for Mrs. Hastings. It was for her, a trap, waiting for the final mourner to lie down willingly. If she refused, Alden would vanish until the next cycle began. If she accepted, the chain would end. No more deaths, no more funerals, just one soul, remembered. The funeral proceeds. Back at the cemetery, the crowd had gathered in confusion. The coffin stood open, empty. Mira looked around, uneasy. Where's Emily? Then from the fog, Emily appeared, covered in dirt, holding the iron box. She approached the coffin. Slowly, she climbed in. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mira ran to her. Emily, what are you doing? Emily smiled weakly, ending it. The lid closed, memory carved in stone. Later, when the box was opened again, it was empty. No body, no trace. Just the photograph of Clara and Alden placed neatly inside. A new gravestone appeared overnight in the hollow beside Alden's, Emily Lang. The one who chose to remember 1998? No one knew who carved it, but the funeral stopped, and the man in white was never seen again. Epilogue. Years later, on a foggy afternoon, a young boy wandered too far from the village trail and found himself in the hollow. He saw a tall man and a young woman sitting together beneath the trees, holding hands. They smiled at him kindly. Run along, the woman said gently. This place isn't for the living. The boy turned and fled, never forgetting the way their eyes shimmered like sunlight through fog. And the hollow stayed quiet. At last, the end.